Most analysts explain Apple's tenfold growth under Tim Cook through a very specific lens. They describe it as a masterclass in refining Steve Jobs' vision and perfecting the art of the incremental product update. This chart of the M1 chip's architecture supports that hardware-centric view. It suggests that Apple's current dominance is a direct result of proprietary silicon and a closed ecosystem that outpaces competitors in pure processing power. But an exclusive investors' letter through veteran commentator He Pin challenges that narrative. The writer, a veteran of the global markets, argues that the hardware itself is secondary to a much larger, less visible strategy. The letter's central thesis is that Cook's defining legacy is a 15-year integration into the Chinese economy. He didn't just use China as a factory, he developed it into Apple's primary engine for both production and consumption. It is unlikely Steve Jobs would have pursued this path. Jobs was driven by a need for aesthetic control, often finding inspiration in the quiet order of Kyoto. That temperament would have struggled with the chaotic, high-velocity demands of the Chinese market. Cook, however, approached the problem with the pragmatism of a supply chain expert. He saw that the only way to achieve Apple's required scale was to tie the company's fate to China's ability to execute at an extreme level of efficiency. Historically, foreign tech giants entered China while keeping their intellectual property at arm's length. European and Japanese firms operated in silos, protecting their internal standards from the local ecosystem. The letter describes Apple as the ultimate catfish, an aggressive force introduced into a stagnant environment that forces every local player to adapt or be left behind. This diagram represents how Apple's rigorous production requirements acted on the market. By mandating near-perfect tolerances, Apple forced the entire Chinese electronics manufacturing base to upgrade its technical capabilities to meet global standards. This pressure created a byproduct that Apple did not necessarily intend. By training this massive supply chain to work at the highest possible level, they built the infrastructure that domestic Chinese competitors would eventually use to mature. We see this result in the hardware quality of Huawei. Their ability to produce premium devices today is a direct downstream effect of the industrial ecosystem Apple spent 20 years cultivating. Xiaomi's current manufacturing capacity follows the same pattern. They are operating on a floor that was permanently raised by Apple's uncompromising entry into the region. Apple's contribution to the region wasn't limited to its own inventory. By mandating world-class production baselines, they left behind a modernized industrial base that now serves as the foundation for the entire global electronics industry. This shift also relies on demand-side innovation, an economic principle where the behavior and volume of a consumer base dictates how fast a technology must advance. Contrast the current market with the early 2000s. At that time, Western users were relatively content with slow hardware cycles and basic functionality, showing little interest in the always-on mobile lifestyle. This changed when the smartphone met a massive emerging Chinese middle class. This demographic embraced mobile technology with an insatiable appetite, demanding constant upgrades in screen resolution and processing speed every 12 to 18 months. To remain competitive in a market where users replace their devices this frequently, manufacturers could no longer rely on traditional development timelines. They were forced to compress years of research and development into months. When Jensen Huang observes that Moore's law is accelerating, he is describing the result of this pressure. To satisfy the Chinese consumer's demand for performance, chip makers were forced into aggressive development cycles that turned theoretical limits into production realities. The speed of modern innovation isn't solely a choice made by engineers in a lab. It is a response to the relentless momentum of the Eastern consumer market. The investor's letter ends with a look at a geopolitical concept called lifting all boats, the idea that a single nation's growth can pull its trade partners into a new era of prosperity. The historical U.S. model selectively lifted specific Cold War allies, ignoring nearby neighbors like Mexico. China's strategy is different. By establishing non-ideological trade routes, they integrate a massive array of global partners into their supply chain, regardless of political alignment. He Pin's analysis suggests that most foreign leaders fail in China because they either treat the market as an extension of the West or as a simple source of cheap labor. Tim Cook avoided both traps. He understood that China represented a unique form of efficiency, and he made the calculated decision to bind Apple's future entirely to that reality. For over a century, the West defined the rules of global economics. Today, those very same definitions are being rapidly rewritten by the sheer scale of China's industrial and consumer demand. Cook spent 15 years prioritizing this geopolitical shift, while his competitors focused on hardware. By the time the world realized the center of gravity had moved, Apple was already locked into its new course.